Good morning, everyone. I'm Kristina Dy-Liacco. I'm the Tibetan Studies Librarian at Starr East Asian Library, and I also serve here at Columbia University, and I also serve the University of Toronto Library. We're so pleased to see you all here in person, and to everyone out in Zoom land, a warm welcome. I understand there are a lot of registrants joining us online, so hello to you all. Before we delve in, some acknowledgements are due. Today's talk is co-sponsored by the Starr East Asian Library, the Modern Tibetan Studies Program, and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. I would like to thank Lauren Hartley for the opportunity to organize this talk, and a special thanks to Shandell Butler at Library of Congress, Susan Anthony at Weatherhead, and Nicole Ogden at Columbia University Library's Finance Department for their perseverance and dexterity in making today's in-person event possible. Today's program is the fifth and final talk in this spring semester's Women in Tibetan Studies lecture series, organized by the Modern Tibetan Studies program. It has been an enriching and inspiring series, and if you did miss any of the talks, they were all recorded, and you can find them on the Modern Tibetan Studies program playlist on YouTube. And today's talk will be included. I find it apropos to conclude the Women in Tibetan Studies series with the librarian, and not to toot our own horn, but truly, where would Tibetan studies be without the stewards who seek out, acquire, catalog, share, and make accessible the collections, resources, and archives upon which scholars, students, and researchers rely, especially those trailblazers who essentially jump-started the activities that enabled Tibetan studies to develop and thrive in North America, at the forefront of which has been Susan Meinheit. With a career spanning 47 years at the Library of Congress, Susan Meinheit has had a pioneering role in the development, management, and conservation of the Library of Congress's vast Tibetan collection, one of the largest in the world. She began her career at Library of Congress as a library clerk, and when she became aware of the early Tibetan holdings that had been long neglected and hidden, she became their champion, and steward, and brought them into the light. And with determination, expertise, and vision, she became the Tibetan and Mongolian specialist at the Asian division, where she has worked ever since. She worked closely with Jean Smith at a crucial time in the development of Tibetan collections at Library of Congress, and her other diverse professional achievements in the service of the community, which, to those of you who know her, are always imbued with a sheer love for her work, have brought wider visibility, accessibility, and understanding of Tibetan texts and materials, contributing in no small way to the support of Tibetan studies in North America and beyond. So thank you so much for coming, Susan. I know it was a hard road to travel here. Ms. Meinheit's talk will be followed by a Q&A. And those of you joining us by Zoom, you can write your questions in the chat box. We'll moderate those later. I also wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded.
I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the Starr East Asia Library for inviting me to be a part of this series, especially Kristina and Lauren for their patient efforts to actually get me here. I feel honored to be included, so thank you very much. While I was preparing my talk, I realized it should have been called an introduction to the history and development of the Tibetan collection, because there are far more stories to be told, but this will give you some idea, and I hope it's useful to know something about our collections. The Library of Congress Asian Division was founded in 1928, first as the Division of Chinese Literature, then renamed as Orientalia, which combined Asia and the Middle East, and finally in 1978 became the Asian Division. We are one of 3 area studies divisions of the library, and we have custody of all books in Asian languages and provide reference assistance for our collections in the Asian reading room.
Yeah, just a little.
All right, then okay.
Okay.
All right, sorry. So it's still not going.
Yeah, there we go. You just use this next.
All right, all right. So anyway, apologies. Okay. So this is the website of the Asian Reading Room, where you'll find links to our social media links and division background and collection descriptions. Our collections contain about 4 million volumes in over 200 languages, represented by 6 major collections: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Tibetan, and Mongolian. And the Asian division currently has over 19,000 volumes of Tibetan texts, including about 4,500 volumes, 4,300 volumes in the rare book collection. The collection also contains 57 serial titles and over 15,000 pieces of microfilm and microfiche. Our early Tibetan collection owes its 20th century origin to several distinguished American scholars and diplomats, primarily William Woodville Rockhill, Joseph Francis Charles Rock, and Bertold Laufer. The report of the Librarian of Congress for the fiscal year 1901 records the first Tibetan books to arrive at the library, received as gifts from William Woodville Rockhill. Quote, "The Tibetan books recently acquired, 13 in number, are in form highly curious. They are long, narrow, and consist of loose leaves between boards, some of which are richly inlaid and wrapped in silk or tied with ribbons." Rockhill was then praised for, quote, "securing to the library a collection which is to bring Oriental students to Washington." Rockhill was an American diplomat in China and considered America's first Tibetologist. He had studied Tibetan and Sanskrit in Paris and traveled to Tibet and Mongolia between 1884 to 1901, where he collected the books later donated to the library. Rockhill eventually donated 65 volumes. There were 57 xylographs and 8 manuscripts, along with his handwritten catalog. In 1942, his widow donated an additional 13 Tibetan items, including 2 especially precious items, which Rockhill had received as gifts from the 13th Dalai Lama when they met at Wutashan in 1908. This mid-19th century tanka depicts, of course, Jesongkampa emanating on white clouds from the heart of Maitreya, the Buddha of the future residing in Tushita paradise. It has now been digitized, and here's the link to the digital images. And this is the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 verses with additional commentaries, Yatomba, and it's also in the Rockhill Tibetan collection number 68. Most of the Rockhill collection are Peking xylographs, and they have just recently, this past year, been cataloged finally. And they are now searchable using the keyword phrase Rockhill Tibetan collection. I also published a LibGuide to the Rockhill collection. This is the connection to it. It's basically a updated version of Rockhill's original hand list. And I'll soon be adding the links to the newly created catalog records for it. So now here are a couple of samples from the Rockhill collection. This is the Crystal Mirror of Dreams. It is a book that Rockhill wrote on the cover. He says that it was purchased in Urga which is now Ulaanbaatar, in 1885. So it's a bilingual Tibetan and Mongolian text. And this is the Sangdan Joe Logger, the String of Jewels, History of the Sangdan Joe, the sandalwood image of the Buddha Shakyamuni, said to have been modeled from life, written by the third Changyа, Rilpe Dorje. It is a 19th century Peking xylograph and consists of 20 folios, also recently cataloged. In 1908, Rockhill also purchased a complete set of the Dege Kangyur in 103 volumes directly for the library. As you know, of course, the Dege printing house was established in 1729 in eastern Tibet. It was one of Tibet's most famous printing monasteries, and blocks for printing the Kangyur were completed in 1733. The set that was acquired by Rockhill is in very good condition and was probably printed in the late 19th century using vermilion ink, of course, as was the rule at Dege. And is a special interest because it differs slightly from the one reproduced by His Holiness the 16th Karmapa in 1970s. So we scanned it in a cooperative project with the Tibetan and Himalayan Digital Library, and Bill is here now to remember that unique experience. And so we sent the file. This was in 2007, 2008, and the files, digital files, are now available in BDRC. The second early contributor to our collections was Bertold Laufer. He was a German-born anthropologist who led ethnological expeditions to China and Tibet between 1901 and 1904 on behalf of the American Museum of Natural History, and again in 1908 to 1910 for the Field Museum in Chicago. He acquired large collections of Chinese, Tibetan, and Mongolian books for the Newberry Library and the John Crear Library in Chicago. In 1917, the Tibetan collection from the John Crear Library was transferred to the Library of Congress. They consist of 106 xylographs in 120 cases, most printed in Peking. So here is a sample from the Laufer collection. It's a lovely Peking xylograph of Milarepa's Namtar. Not yet cataloged. In 1928, we also acquired a complete Nartang Tengyur in 228 volumes by transfer from the Crear Library in Chicago. This set had been acquired by Laufer and taken to Peking by the 13th Dalai Lama in 1908. Nartang was among the largest printing establishments in Tibet and known to have kept the first manuscript of the Tibetan canon. The blocks for printing the Nartang Tengyur were carved in 1730. And we just cataloged it this year. Third figure responsible for our early collections was Joseph Charles Francis Rock, shown here in a 1997 commemorative issue of the National Geographic, for which he wrote 10 articles between 1922 and 1935. Rock was a botanist explorer who lived for 2 years in the Choni Monastery in what is now Gansu province, while conducting fieldwork for the Arnold Arboretum. While at Choni, Rock arranged for printing of the complete Kangyur and Tengyur for the Library of Congress from the original 18th century blocks. And the volumes arrived at the library in 1928. This is a photo from our Prints and Photographs division showing the volumes loaded on mules as they began their 2-year journey to the library. The Choni is considered extremely rare because the entire monastery and printing house were destroyed in local wars in 1929, making ours one of the only few surviving sets. The Kangyur blocks were carved between 1721 and 1731, and the Tangyur blocks between 1753 and 1773. We have microfilmed all 317 volumes, including the volumes which had never been opened since 1928 and had grown together like bricks. The microfilm was then converted to digital images, available fully indexed by title through BDRC. The BDRC images have also been supplemented with the addition of a few missing texts found only in a set kept in Mongolia. In addition, Rock acquired 66 volumes of Sumbungs from the Yunning Monastery in Yunnan. They include the works of the Dalai Lamas 2 and 5 through 8, and the Panchen Lamas 1 through 5, as well as Tsongkhapa's collected works. Jean Smith constantly urged me to find these volumes, and several years ago I located most of them. This year they were finally sorted and cataloged and can now be searched using keyword Joseph F. Rock Tibetan Collection. Rock made several other purchases for the library during his time in China, including our extensive Nashi collection, which was reformatted and updated on our website just this past year. During the following years, there were individual gifts from various donors, some never identified, such as this one, whose provenance is yet to be determined. This is a lovely Sutra of Amitayus, Sepakme, written in silver ink on black paper, and we identified it as part of the Vakil collection, but I think that's a little uncertain at this point. And this is our most ornate volume in the early collections, Sutra of the Perfection of Wisdom in 100,000 verses. Dondokyepa. It is an 18th century manuscript and one volume of a 12-volume set. The sides are painted with the triple gems, and the cover page has 5 layers of silk representing the 5 Buddha families. The opening folios show 2 of the 35 Buddhas of confession and 2 of the 16 arhats. It was a gift in the 1930s from an individual donor. And interestingly, volume 10 of this set is held by the Royal Library of Copenhagen. You may have seen it on their published catalog. So much more research needs to be done to determine its provenance and how this set got to be divided up at some point. These early acquisitions were a solid foundation for establishing the Tibetan collection, of great interest mainly to scholars of classical traditions, which then remained fairly stable for the next few decades, until the tragic events of 1950s brought the urgency of Tibetan cultural preservation to the attention of a wider public, and focus turned to surveying library holdings of Tibetan texts. In November 1957, a conference on American library resources on Southern Asia of the AAS was held at the Library of Congress. Walter Maurer, a Sanskrit scholar and senior librarian in the Southern Asia section from 1954 to 1961, presented a paper on primary source materials located in the U.S., in which he included a survey of Tibetan manuscripts and xylographs. He called for the creation of a union catalog of such texts to assist scholars. Walter Maurer also compiled the library's first list of Tibetan materials with identification numbers, which still guides our work today on getting the collection cataloged. Then in September 1959, a conference on Tibetan studies in the United States was held in the offices of the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. Prominent Tibetan scholars attended, as well as Horace Pullman, Chief of Orientalia Division, 1955 to 1965, who proposed increased funding for libraries to microfilm and catalog Tibetan manuscripts and xylographs. Others argued for more language training and staff to handle the collections and produce catalogs. The conference included reports on the status of Tibetan studies in various universities, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, even State Department. It concluded, the conference members having agreed that the ultimate goal shall be the compilation and preservation of a comprehensive record of all aspects of Tibetan society and culture. Several proposals were discussed for achieving this and increasing Tibetan studies and Tibetan collections in the U.S., including the establishment of a Tibetan studies program at the University of Washington. Efforts to locate Tibetan texts in the U.S. began, and in 1961, Horace Pullman compiled a survey of Tibetan xylographs and manuscripts in institutions and private collections in the United States and Canada. He reported a total of 2,464 volumes, other than sets of the Kangyur and Tengyur, only 1,224 of which had received some sort of identification. Included, of course, were holdings of the Library of Congress. Now, the impact of these developments are beyond the scope of this paper, but deserve credit for highlighting the importance of preserving Tibetan collections in U.S. libraries, including Library of Congress. Unfortunately, Walter Maurer left the library in 1961, and the work he began with the Tibetan collection remained unfinished. Then, of course, the 1960s marked the beginning of the New Delhi office's Tibetan acquisitions, through which our Tibetan collections became most famous. When Tibetans were fleeing Tibet, carrying with them their texts, the library's New Delhi office was actively acquiring books in India under the PL 480 program, a government program which authorized the exchange of agricultural goods for books. The legendary Eugene Smith, who had studied at University of Washington with Dejun Rinpoche, was then a young Tibetologist on contract with the New Delhi office, and to begin working with refugee scholars and lamas to preserve and publish these texts. With the publication of Digital Dharma, Recovering Wisdom, the story has finally now been well documented. And we recently hosted a book talk by Jan Ronis, which has been recorded and now available on the library's events website. These reproduced texts acquired through the New Delhi office for the library and university libraries in our Tibetan Cooperative Acquisitions Program became a large body of primary source materials never previously available. And the core collection by which most early American Tibetologists were trained, Jean had also had the wisdom to make the literature accessible to Western libraries by writing English title pages, contents, and detailed introductions, making it easier to catalog and incorporate them into university libraries. This is an old photo of Jean with our former Librarian of Congress, Dr. Borston, and his wife, 1984. Jean filled out these data worksheets with his extensive notes, like this one. And these were used to create catalog cards, and they had Tibetan script originally, which then had to be transliterated when we finally converted them to our online catalog in the 1970s, 1980s. Between 1965 and 1984, about 8,000 volumes were published and acquired under this program. It was briefly discontinued in 1985 when Jean left the New Delhi office to take up his position as Jakarta Field Director. And it seemed that all available text in exile had already been located and published. But it soon became evident that there were still very important texts being discovered and published in China. So in 1992, I worked with the New Delhi office to revive the program, and we included then Tibetan published in China. The New Delhi office is now still acquiring and cataloging Tibetan works published in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and China for 17 libraries in the SACAP program, including Library of Congress. All are searchable in loc.gov using modified Wiley, with many older records still in the LCALA romanization. Although the majority of our new publications are acquired via the New Delhi office, we also supplement these acquisitions through our vendors in China. The improved access to Tibet and Tibetan scholars in China during the 1990s led us to an increased awareness of new collections being located. News also came about the reestablishment of several original printing houses, and we began acquiring xylograph prints from original blocks, thanks to special contacts with Tibetan scholars in China and Tibet, who were already well aware of our strong collections. The library also sent me on a 4 acquisition trip to Tibet between 1991 and 2001 to acquire publications and establish scholarly contacts. As a result, we have acquired several large collections of these newly printed xylographs from various monastic printing houses in Tibet. In many cases, these volumes contain folios or sections which had not been found in the reprint volumes or entire missing texts. In 1999, after several years' effort, we acquired 300 volumes, specially printed for the Library of Congress at the Dege printing house in northern Sichuan. Dege was thought to have been totally destroyed in the 1950s, but it had in fact been saved by a local leader and began printing from the original 18th century blocks in the early 1980s. Thanks to special arrangements and help from scholars, we were able to acquire newly printed texts also from Lhasa Sholpar Khan and Kumbun and the Tibetan Buddhist Institute in Beijing. This is a sample from the Dege xylograph collection, complete with braided yak hair used to bind the folios in transit. We were finally able to catalog all of these texts this year. Reproductions of original manuscripts were also being published in China, such as the Bon, Kangjur, and Tanjur, the canonical collections of pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet. The original texts date to 8th and 9th century, but were only block printed in the 1840s. They had been hidden in caves until scholars were recently able to assemble them and arrange publication. We acquired the first reprint edition of the Kangjur in 1990, consisting of 154 volumes, and the third expanded Lhasa edition, published by Mogil Latse Rinpoche, of 178 volumes in 2004. This third edition was considered the most authoritative, since it is based on the original Pelkun manuscript, carefully preserved in a cave until the 1990s. We also acquired the Bon Katen in 380 volumes plus, directly from the publisher Tempe Nima in Lhasa. These collections are yet to be fully examined and properly sorted. These collections are all kept in the rare book cage, along with several special collections of manuscripts and xylographs, which we've been able to acquire recently with special yearly funds. These special purchases have recently included reprints of Tibetan texts by Mongolian writers from the collections of Ganden Monastery, the beautiful Murals of Tibet published by Taschen, and this year we just acquired the 325-volume Yeshede Nartang edition of the Kangjur and Tengyur. The rare book cage now has grown to about 1,000 volumes, grown from about 1,000 volumes in 1970 to about 4,500 volumes. Many had never been cataloged, and just this past year, we were very fortunate to hire an expert Tibetan cataloger, Lobsang Tenge, who is working with me in Washington to catalog the Tibetan and Sanskrit rare book arrearage. And thanks to Lauren for having trained him so that he would be such an expert cataloger. During the first year of this 3-year project, we worked together and he has completed over 1,500 Tibetan volumes out of an estimated 2,500 to be cataloged. These collections are now available in the Library of Congress online catalog for the first time. Now, of course, let's not go there. Now, of course, most attention is focused on digital texts. We are receiving BDRC hard drives of each core collection and saving these on the Library of Congress mainframe to preserve them. We also provide links to BDRC databases in our Asian reading room and via our electronic resources. Only a few of our Tibetan titles have been digitized so far because the rare books needed to be cataloged before they can be digitized. So as already mentioned, we digitized the Choni, Kangyur and Tangyur, the Dege Kangyur, and those collections are now available in BDRC, fully indexed by title. In addition, we have digitized one of our rare volumes acquired with special funds in 1999. It's the 17th century manuscript copy of the Sutra of 1,000 Buddhas of the auspicious Aeon, Kelsang, in 2 volumes. It's written in gold ink on indigo dyed paper, which has been overpainted with black ink and varnish. There are 22 fully painted miniatures and more than 600 golden rondelles of Buddhas throughout the text. We also recently digitized a collection related to Rockhill that was acquired a few years ago. The Thomas Wilson Haskins collection, 1902 to 1908. Haskins was Rockhill's translator during his meeting with the 13th Dalai Lama at Wutashan, 1908. He was a young embassy official at that time, serving with Rockhill. And he recorded the meeting in a handwritten diary. And this is the link to the website. It's really a fascinating diary because it's a little less formal than Rockhill's account of this meeting with the 13th Dalai Lama. And I published a blog about it. You can see it on the library's Four Corners blog, and also check the website, and also many photos of diplomatic life at that time, and of Wutashan also a few. It's a fascinating collection. In addition, we are archiving 2 digital library oral history archives. The TOHAP is the digital online archive of oral history interviews collected by Mel Goldstein, Case Western University, during the 1980s and early 1990s. Consists of audio recordings in Tibetan and Chinese with accompanying written transcripts in English, documenting the social and political history of modern Tibet. Included are interviews with over 700 Tibetans, former Tibetan and Chinese government officials, speaking about modern Tibetan history, common folks, and Drepung monastery monks. We're hoping to add photographs sometime soon. He has a great photo collection. A second Tibetan Oral History Project, TOHP, and this is still TOHAP, I'm sorry, is a gift from the Tibet Oral History Project in Marengo, California. We received a total of 169 interviews with Tibetan elders in exile. The printed transcripts and documentation are kept in Asian Division, while the digital files are being preserved by the library's Recorded Sound Division. Finally, although we do not actively acquire works of art, I wanted to share with you another beautiful tanka received as a gift from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama in 2010. And this has now also been digitized. It's Paksam Tishing, an 18th century Tanka of the Buddha, Shakyamuni, with his prominent disciples and Tibetan masters responsible for the textual transmission of the Jataka tales. It's the central Tanka of a set commissioned by Prajotnawang Jampa. And as we learn from the back inscription, it was painted between 1744 to 1746 inside the Jokan Temple, Tibet's most holy shrine. As you can see, our Tibetan collection has evolved from original 18th century xylographs to reprint editions, and back to new xylographs printed from original blocks, now captured in digital technology and modern reprints. It also includes modern Tibetan literature and current publishing in all fields of Tibetan studies. And since this is a living tradition, the life stories of Tibetans are also being preserved through 2 large oral history archives. The tradition is also well illustrated through unique photographs and images on tankas. Our reference collections on Tibet are in all languages, also very comprehensive, with over 300 volumes shelved in the Asian reading room itself. All of these resources gathered over the past 125 years provide rich research materials for Tibetan studies. The Tibetan collection that began with a few highly curious gifts in the early 20th century now continues to be a vital part of the library's Asian collections and is continually expanded and enhanced by access to digital databases and modern scholarship such as you all are producing. So that's a brief introduction to our collections, hopefully inspiring you to visit us. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to take some questions from the audience in the chat, but if I could just ask a question first, because there are there are a number of students here and on Zoom, and I think all of us are, and also other researchers, and all of us are excited to go down to Washington, D.C. now to explore your collection. So just a practical question of how can we access these materials? What are the ways we go about, gaining access to some of these collections?
Oh, sure. I mean, we are open to the public. We were closed sometime during the last.
I think maybe it's best if, just for the people on Zoom. Why don't we just remove this?
During the last couple of years, we were of course closed, but we're now fully open to researchers. Anyone can get a reader's card coming to the Library of Congress. Just register, show a photo ID, get a reader's card, and come to the Asian Reading Room. We do require some advance notice if it's a special project, because most of us in Asian Division are now teleworking 3 days a week and on-site only 2 days a week. So for example, I work Thursday and Friday on-site. So if I know in advance that you want materials, I can prepare them ahead of time, maybe a week ahead, and then bring them to the Asian Reading Room. But if you just want general collections, if you want rare books, you need to make sure I'm going to be on site. Sometimes we have to vary our schedule because we have a lot of visitors, dignitaries, people come to visit. But if I know in advance for rare books, I can assist. If it's just general collections, they can be searched on the Library of Congress LOC.gov, and they can be fetched at any time, whether I'm there or not. The technicians can bring them to the reading room, and we welcome readers. We also have Ask a Librarian, so we can respond within a week to any questions from anyone remotely. Try to help.
Just a reminder to everyone out there in Zoom, you can type your questions in the chat box, and I'm opening it up to the floor. Great, I'm going to pass it on.
I'm very curious about the Haskell materials. I know that you worked on the Dalai Lama's visit to Taiwan in the past, but I haven't heard about this figure Haskell. And it's curious. I mean, I thought Rock Hill spoke Tibetan. I know he traveled in Namdo and Kham a lot. Did he need a central Tibetan dialect translator, or and then just more about what's different about that? You know, the journals and the images. I tried to look up the blog after you mentioned it, but I couldn't find it.
Oh, okay. It's in the four corners of the world. I have a actually I have a link here. You can, but
Yeah,
I thought
I'll track it down, but just for the curious
sure.
public,
Yeah,
to know more.
it's Raquel didn't really need a translator, but Haskins was a junior staffer at the embassy in Beijing, and he was there was required to have a translator accompany Raquel, but actually he records in the diary that Raquel spoke in Tibetan with His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama. But he records his own observations because it's not a formal embassy report. So he makes some very amusing comments about what was actually happening, how arrangements were made for this event to happen, and a very personal account. So it's quite different. It's a really tragic story, actually, because well, you'll read the blog, but he was very young. This was his first. He learned Chinese in I think it was Berkeley, and this was his first embassy post. And he died several months after this meeting. So it's a kind of a fascinating story. Tragic, and but also we have included in the collection are transcripts of interviews with his wife, who had traveled to China from California. She was a socialite. She packed up and moved to Beijing with him, and this is her granddaughter did an interview with her. So this is a transcript of that interview, which gives a lot of interesting insights into the personalities in early China diplomatic, American diplomats in China, and also photographs, and a lot of photographs of China from this collection. So it's really nice. It was donated by one of his relatives who wanted to make sure it was preserved, and she had seen a link on our website about the Raquel collection. So she offered it to the library and asked that it be included with the Raquel collection because she felt that was really significant. And so she supplied actually the brocade, the Tibetan cover for the little diary. So it's really quite charming and unique.
So when you say translator, he was a Chinese. He only knew Chinese.
No.
He also knew that.
He also knew Tibetan. Yes, yeah. So he was translating between he was just sort of the intermediate step, primarily Chinese, and Chinese to who, well, there were some Chinese officials involved in the meeting also. But his Tibetan, I think, was not as good as Raquel's, definitely. But he also appreciated Tibetan culture. He talks about going out for souvenirs in the marketplace after the meeting. And there's one quote in the you'll see it in the blog that he acquired a prayer wheel or prayer beads and started learning to use them a la Lama. So it's really sweet. So he was really taken by the Tibetan culture.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions here? Paul?
So much for that.
I think it's like a directional, you just talked.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk more about the digital collection, both those that are being produced and those that are being archived by TBRC. To what extent are any of those available on the site? or online? I mean, I know you posted some links for some of the more rare items.
Those for Tibetan, those are the only ones that have been digitized, because of course they have to be cataloged. Where our library requires that they be cataloged before they can be digitized, and so like the Kelsang, I had to get someone, Huang Tran is now in New Delhi, to catalog it so that we could digitize it. But it's very hard to get the Tibetan rare books cataloged until last year. We have a 3-year project to catalog the Tibetan rare books in Sanskrit. So once they're cataloged, now that they're cataloged, we can, but there's a long queue for digitizing at the Library of Congress. And there are priority lists, and I've have Tibetan collection, rare Tibetan, the Rock Hill, Laufer, and rock collections on a high priority, but it's hard to get. They've been digitizing a lot of Chinese books recently, the rare, very rare collections. So it'll take time, unfortunately. But whatever I showed is available on the website, and you can search the catalog records, have links to the digital.
Yeah, to follow up on the your catalog description of the cataloging project, there is a question from Audrey in the Dy-Liacco Library in France, who asks about the cataloging process of the Tibetan collection, and is it completed yet? Librarians are confused.
That's
or you just care to comment on the status of catalog?
Yeah, I worked with Lobsang in the rare book cage all of the past year, since we hired him, and it's a 3-year position, and he completed about 1,500 volumes. We started with the large collections because we wanted to get his numbers up. And so most of the Kangyur and Tengyur have been cataloged now, Choni, Nartang, and individual, the Rock Hill collection has been cataloged, and the Joseph Rock collection has been cataloged. Laufer is yet to come. So we have, my estimate was out of 4,300 volumes in the cage, 2,500 were in need of cataloging. So he's done over half. So but it's a joint Tibetan and Sanskrit rare book cataloging project, or cooperating with my colleague in the Southern Asia reference specialist. So this year we're switching to Sanskrit for 1 year, but we're still continuing because we're also labeling them in the cage. So we work together, when he's finished, we bring them back to the cage. We transfer them from the my rare book cage to his rare book vault he's in the Middle Eastern, Southern Asia cataloging section of the library in another building. So we transfer the volumes back and forth and return them to the cage. So it's for the next year, we'll be working on labeling. But they are already in the OPAC, and he's done excellent catalog records, just very, very thorough, with notes. And we work back and forth, of course, because he has to include like the acquisitions data and descriptions, and we work back and forth with, and sometimes references to other catalogs that we can use. Prague collection of the Dege prints, and so they're the regular catalog records, but they're marked as Tibetan rare collection, so they can actually be searched with keyword Tibetan rare collection also.
Are there any other questions in the room? Changzhi?
Thank you so much. This is amazing talk. Thank you. I have a first very quick comment, second question. First, I think about the 3 founders of the Tibetan collection in LC. They do have all kinds of collections in so many places. For instance, novels, LC, Natural History Museum, Columbia. What I mean is beyond Tibetan connection studies. I think that your talk, especially, I think, reminded us. Probably, we hope to have a comprehensive either subject guide, research guide, or some writing, to have all the connections together of each of them for Asian studies largely. Second, my question is that I think Columbia University libraries, especially the art properties, as well as I think nationwide, probably Library of Congress too, have started talking repatriation of the national ethnic treasures back to the original sources in all kinds of ways. Especially currently, I think Jim has left the most practical and least legal issue practice might be, for instance, sharing the digital copy with the original source institution or monastery or the community. So I wonder if Library of Congress, especially your department, have also start thinking about it or plan to do something. Thank you.
There's our Chinese studies library.
Oh, so nice. Thank you for your comments. And first, I agree with the need for some union catalog, even from the beginning. We talked about this many times, Lauren and I and Kristina, about the need to have some sort of a union catalog of Tibetan texts in the U.S. And include, and from the 1960s, they were saying that this would be useful, but so far this has never happened. But hopefully in the future, now we have BDRC, so that's sort of making a digital union catalog of sorts. Eventually, if we digitize our rare books, we would hopefully include them in BDRC, and then there would be, ways to access them. For the other question about repatriation, we haven't really approached that, at least for the Tibetan collection. It's Chinese collection. They recently digitized some of their rare books, and we're sharing them, but I'm not really involved with that. And repatriation, I think, is not, if we digitize the texts in the future, and if we have some reliable way to share them, we would. When we microfilmed the Choni, I collaborated with the Minorities Institute in Chengdu to include them in the Payderma, the comparative edition, because they didn't have access to the Choni. So at that time, when we created a microfilm set of the Choni, we actually sent copies of the microfilm to Chengdu so that they could include them in the Payderma. But that was several years ago when it was possible to do that.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about this 1961 survey that, if I heard the name correctly, Pullman did.
Yes.
And yeah, what that the resource that provided at the time before PL 480, it sounded.
Oh yes, yeah. Thank you. It was definitely before PL 480, and I think it. It resulted in he did two things actually. There was a larger survey of South Asian manuscripts, right, which is large published volume, which included Tibetan. And then there was a separate list of Tibetan, which was published, I think, separately in a journal, but but they were included in the larger volume of South Asia manuscripts. So Tibetan was included with the South Asia manuscripts. And it was a good early resource because, I mean, when I joined the library, that was what I used to find out what was in the cage, because there was no other way to discover what was there for these many, many decades. So it was a very useful source.
There's a question in the chat from Edwina Williams. Jaya Nima Dorje, who was a scholar, worked on the catalog in New York Museum.
Yes.
They're about to publish his book on history and anthropology of Jayap region. And she's asking some practical things about distribution, ISBN, and yeah, if you'd like to answer that, but also they also have some of his original interview materials, and that, to piggyback on that, how active is the Library of Congress in acquiring archival materials, and what are some of the exciting collections that maybe you've recently acquired that you could talk about?
First, for if there are oral interviews, yeah, so we're divided by format primarily. So Asian Division has primarily custody of print materials. Although I make some exceptions for things like Haskins photos. And sometimes, we have to make exceptions. But Recorded Sound Division of the library has archives. For example, the other Tibetan Oral History project from California is maintained there. But the Goldstein's Oral History Archive was a gift in 2004. And it was the gift agreement was that we would digitize it ourselves, or transfer, he would transfer, he had digital, but they were in an odd format. So it took, 10 years to get them into the library's system. And so it took a lot of work. So usually that was kind of an exception that we would be directly involved. Otherwise, it would be Recorded Sound. And Manuscripts Division has custody of archival materials. Although, again, sometimes it's necessary to make exceptions because they don't accept certain collections. So I have some diaries of former diplomats that I keep in the rare book cage. So things like that. Recently, a Mongolian woman donated her father's prison diaries from when he was persecuted, and collections that he had acquired. So those, I will keep in the rare book cage along with the rare books. And archives from former U.S. ambassador to Mongolia are there, all of his archives. But generally, we're not acquiring archival materials just because technically they should go to Manuscripts Division. We have Owen Lattimore's papers in the Manuscript Division, which recently we just, Gray, it might be interesting for you. We just recently published his letters with Dy-Liacco.
Oh,
And the letters between Lattimore and Dy-Liacco that are in the manuscripts. So my colleague, the Mongolian cataloger in the library, Surul, has gathered all of those letters, and we published them with the Foreign Ministry just a few months ago.
Online or in a book form?
A book.
Okay.
A book, yeah, yeah. And it's really a nice book. It's got all the letters, but not translated yet. If but so sometimes, yeah.
Any other questions on the floor?
I'm curious about the, sorry. I'm curious about the monastery that Rock went to and got this collection. I mean, it looks very far southeast, you know, and so, but you were saying they have maybe not a full collection, but a lot of the Dalai Lama's biographies, a lot of the Panchen Lama's biographies.
Yeah, second
What-
5 through 8.
Yeah. So, and what else do they have? Do they have local Lama's biographies, sort of Sungbom as well, or just these? And do you have any sense of why this distant monastery had these collections, whether the blocks were carved locally or sent out in some ways?
I think that Lobsang had a difficult time determining which blocks had been used to print these. And I think that it was pretty much undecided. I know Jean, because Jean had given me Rock's hand list, right, and asked me to find them. And Jean always asked me to determine from the colophons where they were printed. And I was matching them with, different, Lhasa editions or Kumbum editions, but they didn't quite match. And Lobsang found that also. So it's still sort of not determined. And the history of that monastery, I remember in Beijing at one of those conferences, somebody said it was a different name for that monastery. And it's something I've never had time to research, but if someone would like to do that, it would be fantastic contribution. So the other question about cataloging path. That's hard. It took us many years to get. We had we previously had a Japanese cataloger for many years who could work with Tibetan also. And when he retired, there was no one in Library of Congress who, except New Delhi office, but no one to do the rare books with me. It's hard to get positions for Tibetan catalogers. I tried for many years to get someone for the rare books, and many years. And you just have to be patient. But I think if people want to catalog Tibetan, then they should just do it. They should learn. They should do a MLS and focus. I mean, I had to do my MLS, and it was challenging, because it wasn't about Tibetan books. But at the end, I designed a history of Tibetan books as my independent studies for one semester, and made it useful. But an MLS is really required for cataloging. It's so I think that if they can get an MLS and then use their languages, maybe combine it with other languages, that's a useful thing, because there won't be many Tibetan specific positions. They could be Tibetan and Mongolian catalogers, or they could be Tibetan and Chinese catalogers. If they combine it, or Sanskrit, Lobsang is now doing Sanskrit for us. So South Asian language, any other language, probably enhances. But if they really want to just do Tibetan cataloging, I'd say do it and just wait for the position. Keep trying. So, yeah, but it would be certainly rewarding. I mean, Tibetan catalogers in our New Delhi office, of course, has an excellent Tibetan cataloger, Nalang Sepak, and Phuong Tran is in the New Delhi office also. So we do have positions in New Delhi for catalogers, and also Sanskrit catalog. They catalog all South Asian languages in New Delhi. So I think I wouldn't be discouraged by the lack of positions. Just get training.
Any questions? If anyone out there in Zoom would like to submit a question, I don't see any at the time. Then I just have a question sort of to follow up on what you just mentioned about the New Delhi field office, just for those of us here who you mentioned the SACAP program, which is administered by the Library of Congress Delhi office to distribute books, acquire and then distribute books for different universities who subscribe to with the profile of acquisitions. Could you just describe the process, like the Delhi field office, what it does? Yeah, who's there, and sort of the process of sharing all of these books from India, Nepal, across the Himalayas, and now including publishing in China.
Oh, well, we have two American administrators in the New Delhi office. We have a field director, a director, and a deputy director. And they often rotate between, we have other overseas offices as well, Jakarta, Cairo, Nairobi, Rio. And so they often rotate amongst these positions. And so they're trained administrators. Currently, it's Fel Cannon, who was in New Delhi office for a long time, and Fong Tran, who used to be our Tibetan cataloger of sorts at Library of Congress in Washington, is now there as deputy director. So they work with the administrators, manage a team of language catalogers who are locally hired in Tibetan, of course, and all South Asian languages. And so they're responsible for cataloging and acquiring, and they make field trips to publishers around India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives. They even went recently. And so they make acquisitions trips from the New Delhi office to check out local publications and acquire things, bring them back to the New Delhi office, and select for the participants, whoever's a participant in a particular program. There's 17 now for Tibetan. And then they, if there are questions about whether to acquire something, say a large expensive set from China, they will survey participants to see if they can afford it. They would like to acquire it. And sometimes if there's a question, they'll just ask me, because I'm still the recommending officer for Tibetan. So if there's some question about acquiring something, we have a very good relationship and we work back and forth. But it's mainly local hires, and often when they retire, they get some sort of a special immigration status, so that they Pema Dorji retired sadly many years ago, right, and came to the U.S. So that's kind of a bonus that people, local hires, get. But it's a very productive office. Gene used to always joke that he loved New Delhi because people actually worked there. But they do excellent cataloging and acquisitions, and they travel. They also acquire Tibetan from the Tibetan publishers in Nepal primarily, because we can't acquire them directly from China, even though we tried many years ago.
So I thought you said that you had a way now to purchase books from booksellers in China. That's still not the case?
Yeah, well, if my first choice is to acquire via New Delhi.
Right.
And if they can't get something, then I order through our China vendor in Beijing. So we have, the Chinese collection has 4 vendors in Beijing, the regular state publishing houses. And we're not allowed to really go outside of that. And so and they produce wonderful book lists of Tibetan. And if sometimes I used to send the book list to New Delhi, have them check. But recently, just been relying on New Delhi to acquire. If they can't acquire something, then I'll request it, and our vendor in Beijing will happily supply it. But it won't get cataloged properly, and it won't get into the the SICAP participants. If I do that, because it's only acquiring it for Library of Congress.
So it goes to the Library of Congress, but it doesn't get cataloged.
Yes, yeah, but now we have Lobsang there, and we have a cataloger in the China section who knows Tibetan also somewhat, so it now can get cataloged. And Lobsang was in between the rare books, when we would not be able to get to the cage in time to get enough for him to catalog. He has been working on the arrearage. There was a small arrearage of China Tibetan publications, and he's also been working on those in between. So if we managed to extend him, we would have some way. But for many years, the Tibetan acquired in China, I was doing more acquisitions of it for a while, and they would just sit there because no one would catalog them. So I rely on New Delhi first.
And if I could ask a follow-up question, so given that there's just these 4 distributors in China that can collect, you said they have a pretty good list. But what's your sense? Is their material just coming from the Miri Beijerkong, or are they going out and getting the local publications and all the kind of privately published?
It's all
Official.
the Miri Beijerkongs.
Okay.
Yeah, from the 5 main ones, right? So it's just all standard author. And actually, I guess it's okay to mention this. I just got a notice that Ganjon, what is the literary Bojong Nante, was it the Tibetan Buddhism? Yes, is now considered an internal publication. And our subscription was canceled last week. And the literary no from Gansu, from it's the it was just last week. The literary, huh? No, it must what's the name of your anyway. So this the literary journal it's from Gansu, I think, right, Jim? Anyway, I can tell you later. But so this literary magazine and the Tibetan Buddhism are now declared as internal, and we had to cancel our subscription last week, which was really unfortunate. But that's the way things are. And if you can still get them through
other means. Thank you. I mean, given what a kind of obvious problem this is for the Library of Congress, is there anything that we could do to support you, scholars I mean, do you think it's just hopeless that collecting Tibetan material from the place where Tibetan material is produced the most, just there's no way to get around the kind of limits that have been set up? You've been dealing with this for so long. So
yeah. I mean, there previously were some ways to do this, or I mean, there were some openings and things that we could do, and certainly we had a lot of support from from Chinese and Tibetan scholars and institutions to share their materials with us. And so much enthusiasm about sharing. I mean, it's just wonderful, right? I mean, just and I think that still exists, but I think that this currently the circumstances are just such that we have to just accept what is the current situation and be patient for someday things change. But I think in the meantime, if you know, what we can do, because we're a government agency, and I know, you know, sometimes your acquisitions trips, you know, you acquire things and that's fantastic, you know, so I think we have to sort of collaborate. You can acquire certain things that we cannot right now, and that's important.
Sorry, I'll just say one last thing on that. I would, it's a good moment to acknowledge all that Library of Congress has done. And I don't know if people realize that when you talk about the 17 receiving institutions, almost all university libraries rely solely on what Library of Congress acquires, because as you mentioned, they don't have this dedicated Tibetan Studies librarian like we do now with Kristina here at Columbia, and just, you know, full-time catalogers to process the materials. So first of all, that it's just been so rich over the years, and want to acknowledge that. And also what you're pointing to, and we also know that distribution, even when the things are published, even if you can get them, the distribution in China is so haphazard, especially for the private publications. Pretty much you walk home with your 1,000 books and you give them away to your friends, right? So it's that you have to basically cover their own ISBN costs, etc. The points to, you know, people who do research should realize you can't get everything from a single institution. Mm. And as you're saying, if people can contribute via their local institutions, yes. And in a sense, we do have a union catalog in the WorldCat. Yes, as long as the materials are cataloged, and the catch is if we have backlog at our different institutions, right?
And if they're cataloged in Tibetan,
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up here that if there's a member institution in OCLC with cataloging capabilities like Columbia University, so Lobsang is sitting here. He does a lot of the cataloging here and so a lot of the original records that you'll see, preliminary and full records, is done by Lobsang here. So I think together there are other, I think in England, Charles Manson is very active, and in Germany, they always seem to have, Germany seems to have a very robust acquisitions program there. So yeah, collectively, we can get there, I think. Yes. Work on our backlogs. Yeah. So, okay, maybe one last question.
Thank you. I had this question earlier, and perhaps there's a tangential link about the Laufer papers and the Laufer volumes that you're embarking on cataloging. And so perhaps thinking historically about the difficulty in acquisitions, whether there were any of his personal papers about the acquisitions at LOC, because he was between New York and Chicago, and whether, you know, if any of those papers are in the collection or...
Not that I know of. The only sort of documents we have about the collection are in the Library of Congress annual reports, where they, you know, talk about acquiring them, and maybe they'll give some, you know, reference to, you know, Laufer said that this was, you know, these were taken by the 13th Dalai Lama, you know, to Beijing in 1908. But that's the only way that that we have documented them. But I think the archives are in the aren't they in Chicago still? The Laufer collection. I think the Field Museum still has extensive files about Laufer. I think they were transferred from the Career, maybe still in the Field Museum, but that would be a good research project for Tony. And I'd love to know no more. There, he published so many papers, and there are a few of his, off prints of his papers, loan words in Tibet. In Tibetan was one of them. But I think Laufer is a fascinating figure. And I think more research on him would be fantastic. And I'm hoping that we catalog the collection. That's top priority for after Sanskrit has had its year.
I have so many other questions, but I think we've reached our time. And so I just want to, again, thank you so much for making the trip up here and for such a wonderful talk and telling us more about the Library of Congress and your role there.
Thank you so much. Thank you.